Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of Whitehall Palace in January 1547, watching servants hurry past with blood-stained linens and bowls of fetid water. The stench that seeps from beneath the royal chambers is so overwhelming that courtiers press perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces just to breathe. Behind those heavy oak doors, England's most feared monarch lies dying in agony, his massive body consumed by a cocktail of diseases that have turned him into a grotesque parody of the golden prince he once was. This is the story of how absolute power corrupted not just a soul, but a body. How the man who had reshaped England through sheer force of will would spend his final days screaming in pain while his own flesh rotted around him. The king who had executed 2 wives and countless enemies now faced an enemy he could not behead, could not exile, could not intimidate into submission. Death itself had come for Henry VIII, and it would not be denied. Before we descend into the horror of those final winter days, I want you to know where you're listening from. Comment below and let me know which corner of the world you're joining me from as we explore this grotesque chapter of English history. It's incredible that we can gather from across the globe to witness the final collapse of one of history's most notorious tyrants. The journey to this putrid finale began decades earlier with a young man who seemed blessed by the gods themselves. When Henry ascended to the throne in 1509, at age 17, he was everything a Renaissance king should be: tall, athletic, intelligent, and devastatingly handsome. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about his golden hair, his powerful physique, and his prowess in the jousting yard. He could compose music, speak multiple languages, and debate theology with the finest scholars in Europe. This was no sickly medieval monarch clinging to power through bloodline alone. This was a king who commanded respect through sheer physical presence and intellectual brilliance. But power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls, and Henry's corruption would manifest in ways both political and physical. The first signs appeared in his 30s, when the athletic prince began to thicken around the waist. Court physicians attributed this to good living and prosperity, but something more sinister was taking root in the royal body. The king's legendary appetite for food was matched only by his appetite for violence, and both would grow more grotesque with each passing year. The transformation accelerated after 1536, when Henry suffered a devastating jousting accident that nearly killed him. His horse, a massive destrier weighing over 1,000 pounds, fell directly on top of him, crushing his left leg and leaving him unconscious for hours. When he finally awoke, courtiers noticed something had changed. The king's temper, always volatile, became truly murderous. His weight began ballooning at an alarming rate. Most concerning of all, the wound on his leg refused to heal properly, becoming a festering sore that would plague him for the rest of his life. Modern medical experts believe this accident triggered a cascade of health problems that would eventually consume him. The head injury may have caused traumatic brain damage, explaining his increasingly erratic behavior and explosive rages. The leg wound became chronically infected, requiring constant medical attention and causing excruciating pain that drove him to consume vast quantities of food and drink, seeking relief. What began as a sporting accident became the foundation for a decade of mounting medical horror. As Henry's body began to fail, his paranoia reached new heights. He became convinced that enemies were everywhere, plotting against him, mocking his growing infirmity. The king, who had once been admired across Europe for his vitality, now struggled to hide his physical deterioration from foreign ambassadors and his own courtiers. Court artists were instructed to continue portraying him as the vigorous monarch of his youth, creating an increasingly bizarre disconnect between royal propaganda and royal reality. The ulcers on his legs became the most visible symbol of his decline. These weren't simple wounds, but deep, suppurating craters that emitted a stench so foul that servants would vomit when changing his bandages. Contemporary accounts describe wounds so severe that bone was visible through the necrotic tissue. The king's physicians applied every remedy known to Tudor medicine, from boiled onions to powdered human skull, but nothing could stop the relentless spread of infection. Henry's attempts to hide his condition became increasingly desperate and bizarre. He commissioned the construction of mechanical devices to help him move his enormous bulk, which contemporary sources suggest had expanded to nearly 400 pounds. Special chairs were built with hidden wheels and pulleys, allowing servants to move the king without revealing his inability to walk unassisted. His clothing was redesigned with padding and strategic cuts to disguise his grotesque proportions, creating the illusion of the powerful monarch he had once been. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical deterioration. Henry had built his entire identity around being the most powerful man in England, someone whose very presence could inspire terror or devotion. Now, he found himself helpless against the betrayal of his own flesh, dependent on servants for the most basic functions while maintaining the fiction of absolute authority. The contrast between his public image and private reality created a kind of living hell that would define his final years. Court records from this period reveal the extraordinary measures taken to manage the king's condition while preserving royal dignity. Teams of physicians worked in shifts, not just to treat his ailments, but to help cover up the extent of his deterioration. Special protocols were established for audiences with foreign dignitaries, ensuring that the king was positioned to hide his worst deformities while maintaining the illusion of strength and control. The stench became so overwhelming that palace workers developed elaborate systems for managing the royal quarters. Windows were kept open despite winter cold, incense burned constantly, and perfumed waters were sprinkled throughout the chambers. Servants learned to breathe through their mouths when attending the king, and many developed permanent respiratory problems from exposure to the toxic atmosphere of the royal sick room. Henry's eating habits during this period became truly monstrous. Unable to exercise due to his infected legs, he consumed enormous quantities of food seeking relief from constant pain. Royal kitchen records show meals that would have fed a dozen men being prepared for the king alone. Rich meats, sugary confections, and vast quantities of wine became his primary comfort as his body continued its relentless decay. The king's mental state deteriorated along with his physical condition. Courtiers reported increasingly erratic behavior, with Henry alternating between periods of near delirium and moments of terrifying lucidity. He would ramble about long-dead enemies, issue contradictory orders, and fly into murderous rages over imagined slights. The royal court became a maze of whispered conversations and careful maneuvering as everyone struggled to anticipate the unpredictable moods of their dying tyrant. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of Henry's nightmares. His personal chaplain recorded how the king would awaken screaming, claiming to see the faces of his executed wives and victims standing at the foot of his bed. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and countless others haunted his sleep, their silent accusations tormenting the man who had sent them to their deaths. These supernatural visitations, whether real or imagined, added another layer of horror to an already grotesque situation. The royal physicians found themselves in an impossible position. Their patient was dying, but admitting failure could result in their own execution. They applied increasingly desperate treatments, from experimental surgeries to exotic potions imported from across Europe. Nothing worked. The king's condition continued deteriorating, but the doctors maintained elaborate pretenses of optimism while privately preparing for the inevitable. The political implications of Henry's decline created additional layers of tension within the court. With young Edward as his only male heir, powerful factions were already positioning themselves for the coming regency. The king's deteriorating mental state made him increasingly susceptible to manipulation, leading to a dangerous game of court intrigue where the stakes couldn't be higher. The contrast between Henry's public image and private reality became most stark during his final public appearances. Foreign ambassadors described a king who seemed to have doubled in size, his face so swollen that his eyes appeared as tiny slits in a mass of diseased flesh. Yet royal proclamations continued to describe him as vigorous and healthy, creating a bizarre disconnect between official propaganda and obvious reality. The final months of 1546 saw Henry's condition reach new levels of horror. The ulcers on his legs had grown so severe that they required constant attention from teams of physicians and attendants. The king's mobility became so limited that he was essentially confined to his chambers, though elaborate deceptions were maintained to hide this fact from potential enemies, who might see weakness as opportunity. The psychological torment of his situation was perhaps captured best in his increasingly desperate attempts to control his legacy. Henry obsessively revised his will, trying to ensure that his version of events would survive him. He commissioned elaborate funeral monuments and tomb designs, seeking to create a permanent image of himself as the powerful monarch he had once been, rather than the diseased wreck he had become. As winter approached in 1546, those closest to the king began to understand that the end was near. The elaborate machinery of royal deception that had hidden his condition for so long was beginning to break down. The stench had become impossible to mask, the king's appearance too grotesque to explain away, and his mental deterioration too obvious to ignore. The stage was set for one of the most horrific royal deaths in English history. A king who had dominated Europe through force of personality and physical presence would spend his final days as a prisoner in his own rotting body, surrounded by the evidence of his own mortality, while desperately trying to maintain the illusion of divine authority. The Golden Prince had become a grotesque tyrant, and the grotesque tyrant was about to become a corpse. The end, when it came, would be as ugly and brutal as the life that preceded it. But that horror, that final collapse of flesh and spirit, that ultimate reckoning between a tyrant and his mortality, must wait for our next journey into the darkness of Henry's final days. The winter of 1547 had arrived with a vengeance, and within the gilded walls of Whitehall Palace, something far more sinister than the season's chill was taking hold. The king's condition had deteriorated beyond all recognition. What had begun as infected leg wounds had become a symphony of bodily rebellion that would make his final weeks a living nightmare. The ulcers on Henry's legs had evolved into something that defied medical understanding. Palace physicians documented wounds that seemed to breathe with their own malevolent life, expanding and contracting as pus and blood seeped through layers of rotting flesh. The smell had become so overwhelming that servants were required to burn aromatic herbs continuously just to make the royal chambers habitable. Even then, many attendants would emerge from their duties, retching violently, their stomachs unable to process the assault on their senses. But the physical decay was only part of the horror. Henry's mind had begun manifesting the most disturbing symptoms of his deteriorating condition. Court records describe episodes where the king would suddenly stop mid-sentence during audiences, his eyes rolling back as he appeared to be listening to voices that no one else could hear. He would nod and respond to these phantom conversations, sometimes arguing with invisible figures, sometimes pleading with them for mercy. The royal physicians were baffled by these episodes. They had no framework for understanding what modern medicine would recognize as the psychological effects of chronic pain, infection, and possible neurological damage from years of head injuries sustained during his jousting career. To them, the king's behavior suggested either divine possession or demonic influence, neither of which they were equipped to treat. During one particularly disturbing incident recorded in the private papers of Archbishop Cranmer, Henry suddenly began screaming in the middle of a Privy Council meeting. He pointed to an empty corner of the room and shouted accusations at what he claimed was the ghost of Anne Boleyn, demanding to know why she had cursed him with her dying breath. The assembled nobles sat in stunned silence as their sovereign argued with empty air, his voice growing more shrill and desperate with each exchange. These hallucinations became a regular feature of Henry's final months. He would see Thomas More standing at the foot of his bed, shaking his head in disappointment. He claimed to hear the voices of the countless monks he had executed during the dissolution of the monasteries, chanting prayers for his damnation. Most disturbing of all, he would sometimes speak tenderly to the air beside his pillow, believing he was conversing with his deceased wives in their happier moments, only to suddenly turn violent when the imaginary conversations took darker turns. The practical challenges of maintaining royal dignity while managing Henry's condition required extraordinary measures. The palace staff developed an elaborate system of signals and codes to communicate about the king's state without speaking openly. A certain arrangement of flowers might indicate that Henry was experiencing a particularly bad day with his ulcers. The positioning of candles could signal that he was in the grip of one of his hallucinatory episodes. Even the way servants folded linens carried meaning about whether it was safe to approach the royal chambers. The king's massive bulk had become a logistical nightmare. Moving him required teams of servants working in carefully choreographed shifts. Special platforms and pulleys had been installed throughout his private apartments to facilitate transfers from bed to chair to the various medical apparatus that had become part of his daily routine. The wooden floors of Whitehall had been reinforced in several locations to support the weight of the king and his increasingly elaborate furniture. Henry's eating habits had become grotesque spectacles that horrified even his most loyal attendants. His appetite remained voracious despite his condition, but the physical act of eating had become a torturous process. The king's jaw had become so swollen and painful that he could barely open his mouth wide enough to accommodate food. Meals had to be specially prepared, with everything cut into tiny pieces or ground into paste-like consistency. The sounds emanating from the royal dining chambers during mealtimes were said to be unbearable. Henry would grunt and wheeze as he struggled to swallow, sometimes choking on his food and requiring assistance from servants who had to physically support his head and neck. The king's table manners, once refined and courtly, had devolved into something animalistic. He would grab food with his hands, stuff it into his mouth, and allow excess to fall onto his clothing and the floor around him. Perhaps most disturbing was the king's relationship with his own reflection. Mirrors had been removed from most of his chambers after several incidents where Henry had become violent upon seeing his own image. On one occasion, he had thrown a heavy pewter goblet at a mirror, shattering it and cutting several servants who were cleaning up the fragments. He claimed that the mirrors showed him demons wearing his face, mocking him with their grotesque appearances. The few mirrors that remained were positioned so that Henry could only see small portions of himself at a time. Even then, he would sometimes become transfixed by his own reflection, studying his bloated features with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Court observers noted that he would spend long minutes touching his face, as if trying to confirm that the distorted image in the mirror was truly his own. The king's relationship with his clothing had become another source of psychological torment. The elaborate garments that had once showcased his impressive physique now served as painful reminders of his physical decline. Royal tailors were constantly making adjustments to accommodate his changing body, letting out seams and adding panels of fabric to maintain the illusion of proper fit. Even these modifications were often insufficient, and Henry would sometimes tear at his clothes in frustration, ripping expensive fabrics and destroying garments that had taken weeks to create. The psychological impact of these physical changes extended to every aspect of Henry's behavior. His legendary temper, always unpredictable, had become completely unhinged. He would fly into rages over the smallest perceived slights, screaming at servants for breathing too loudly or walking too heavily. These outbursts were often followed by periods of deep depression, where he would lie motionless for hours, staring at the ceiling and refusing to acknowledge anyone's presence. Court records describe incidents where Henry would suddenly demand to be taken to locations within the palace that held happy memories, only to become violently upset when he arrived and found that the reality didn't match his nostalgic recollections. He would rage about how everything had changed, how nothing was as it should be, seemingly unaware that he was the one who had changed most dramatically. The king's sleeping patterns had become completely erratic. He would sometimes remain awake for days at a time, kept alert by the constant pain from his ulcers and the fevered activity of his deteriorating mind. When exhaustion finally overtook him, he would sleep for 12 to 16 hours straight, often waking disoriented and confused about where he was or what day it was. His dreams, according to servants who had to wake him from nightmares, were filled with apocalyptic visions. He would describe in disturbing detail dreams where he was judged by a tribunal of his victims, where England was consumed by fire, where his children were murdered before his eyes. These nocturnal terrors often left him shaking and weeping, reduced to a state of vulnerability that was almost unbearable for those who had known him in his prime. The practical management of Henry's bodily functions had become a source of constant humiliation for the once proud king. His bladder and bowel control had deteriorated to the point where accidents were frequent and unpredictable. The royal chambers were equipped with absorbent materials and cleaning supplies that had to be constantly replenished. Teams of servants worked around the clock to maintain basic hygiene, a task that required them to handle the king's massive body with a combination of medical necessity and desperate attempts to preserve his dignity. The smell of decay that surrounded Henry wasn't limited to his infected leg wounds. His entire body seemed to be breaking down from within, emitting odors that suggested internal rot and corruption. Palace physicians applied various perfumes and aromatic treatments, but these only created a sickening combination of floral scents mixed with the underlying stench of disease. Visitors to the royal chambers often had to excuse themselves to vomit, and even experienced courtiers found it difficult to maintain their composure in the king's presence. Henry's voice, once powerful enough to command attention across a crowded hall, had become a painful whisper punctuated by violent coughing fits. The infections in his body had affected his respiratory system, making normal speech difficult and exhausting. When he attempted to raise his voice, as he often did during his rages, the effort would trigger spasms of coughing that would leave him gasping for breath and spitting blood. The king's hands, once capable of wielding sword and pen with equal skill, had become swollen and clumsy. His fingers were so enlarged that his rings had to be cut off to prevent circulation problems. Writing, which had been one of his great pleasures, became almost impossible. When he attempted to sign documents, his signature would be barely legible, a shaking scrawl that bore little resemblance to the bold hand that had once commanded respect across Europe. As Henry's condition worsened, the psychological defenses he had built up over a lifetime of absolute power began to crumble. The man who had never been contradicted, never been denied, never been forced to confront his own limitations, was now faced with the ultimate opposition, his own body's rebellion against his will. The rage and frustration this generated were beyond anything his courtiers had ever witnessed, creating an atmosphere of terror that permeated every corner of the palace. The winter of 1547 had become Henry's personal hell, a season of decay and madness that would finally claim the life of England's most notorious king. In those final horrifying months, the tyrant who had terrorized a nation discovered that the most fearsome enemy he would ever face was the rotting prison of his own flesh, a body that had become both his throne and his tomb.